Hey, everybody. I'm Greg Chomut, and you're watching Grade 10 History.
Hey there. Today we're going to be talking.
All right. Never gets old. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about women's rights, particularly women's right to vote, and how they progressed early in the 20th century or the early 1900s. And I'm just switching something over here so I can see my notes. And these ladies that you're looking at right now, they're what's known as the famous five. Five ladies that played a really big role in fighting for women's rights. You know what? I'll read you their names. That's Nellie McClung. She's she's one of the two most famous. Louise McKinley, Irene Parlby, Henrietta Muir Edwards, and Emily Murphy. And we're going to get in the assignment today, you're going to take a little bit more of a look into who these ladies are. Now, anyways, we have to start with before the 1900s. Women in Canada were not considered people, believe it or not. It seems like by our standards today, that seems absolutely outrageous, and it is. But before this time, women in Canada weren't considered people. What that meant was they weren't allowed to own things. They weren't allowed to own property. They couldn't have jobs. And maybe most importantly, they weren't allowed to vote. So what ended up is they were considered property of the most predominant men in their life, just like anything, like a table or a house would be property, right? So when a woman was born and when they were a girl, they'd be the property of their father. If their father died, they become the property of their oldest brother. When they got married, they become the property of their husband. Now, even though this is a terrible situation that's oppressive to women, obviously there were still women that had good lives, but having a good life was really dependent on the men in your life being good people, right? And that's not a situation that is really fair and just for anybody. So, why did things start changing? What's important about this time that allowed things to change? Well, before World War One, there were women fighting for equal rights for women and for the right to vote. But World War One became a major catalyst to get this going. It became the thing that ignited the success of the fight for women's rights. Because during World War One, so many Canadian men were being sent over to Europe to fight that all of the jobs that they left here in Canada were vacant, and they needed people to do the work of the country, work in the jobs to keep the country going at home. And especially there was a greater demand because now because of the war, their factories were converted into and built new factories, building ammunitions and machinery for the war. And who filled these jobs is women. So the workforce was predominantly women throughout the course of World War One. And when World War One ended, men came back, and women were told to go back into their traditional roles of being, looking after the house, cooking, cleaning, looking after the children. A lot of women said, "I don't think so. Kind of like this freedom," and the women proved that they were able to, do the work just as well as any man could. Now, there was also some other developments during the war where, let's say, Canadian nurses that were fighting over, or not fighting, but were over in the war looking after the soldiers and really risking their lives for the country. there was a very like a popular consensus that these women had demonstrated that if they're willing to risk their lives and work that hard for the country, then they deserve to get the right to vote. So in 1917, the vote was extended to these women. Also, Prime Minister Borden at the time, after Vimy Ridge in 1917, um, needed to grow the ranks of the military, so was thinking about instituting conscription. We talked about the other day, and it was his belief that if he extended the vote to women who were closely related to soldiers that were fighting in the war, that they would be in favor of conscription to get more men over there to, help their loved ones. And so the vote was extended to, wives, sisters, and maybe cousins of military men. So 1917 is when women started to get the vote in Canada. But that is not the final, like the finale of the story. These women continued to vote, and this lady right here, to work for the vote. This lady, Nellie McClung, is one of the most famous of the group. She, I guess, was kind of also she had a great sense of humor, and she did some things like she did some presentations in public that kind of spun things around the other way, where she pretended to already be a lawmaker, and she was up on stage talking about how silly it would be to extend the vote to men, and using all the arguments that men used about women, turned them against them. And it showed the world how kind of ridiculous these ideas of women not, having the mental capacity or the capacity of like have the gut to vote, like be able to make the hard decisions that men are so able to do. When she spun that around and used those arguments against men, it really showed how ridiculous that they were. Louise McKinney, one of the women up there, she was the first woman to be elected to legislature in Alberta, and the first kind of woman politician to be elected in Canada. And I just want to make sure that I don't miss anything. In 1918, the vote was extended. This was a big day for women's right to vote, and the vote was extended to any women in Canada over the age of 21. But this wasn't a full victory, because it really only applied to white women, and there was still regulations in place to stop new immigrants of color from voting, and also there was regulations in place that stopped Indigenous women from voting, because at this time even Indigenous men were not allowed to vote, aside from a few situations where Indigenous men who fought in World War I were able to vote when they returned, but they were also forcibly had to give up their status. So they came at a great loss, because they had to give up their status as an Indigenous person. So it wasn't looked on as a good thing. And the kind of fight for women's rights, I guess, in Canada comes to fruition in something called the Persons Case. It started in 1927 and then ruled in 1929 that women were people, finally, and also that they were allowed to serve at all levels of government, allowed to vote, and in the top level of government, as far as lawmaking goes, the Senate, that was the big part of this case, and at that point, women were allowed to become senators in Canada. But I cannot finish talking about women's rights to vote without talking about when Indigenous people finally had the right to vote, because I brought that up later. I looked that up today, In 1958, under Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, the government began drafting the Canadian Bill of Rights that had an emphasis on equal rights for all Canadians. Once this Bill of Rights was passed into law, it took away any legal framework that could deny Indigenous people the right to vote. And I don't normally care about dates as much as ideas in history, but I think this is a very important date. On March 31st, 1960, portions of the Canada Elections Act were repealed because of that Bill of Rights to allow status Indians, that's the legal terminology, the right to vote. So that's March 31st, 1960. This really shook me, actually, to find this out. Although I had known it took a lot longer for Indigenous people to get the right to vote in Canada, I started thinking that really, that's not that long ago. I mean, my parents were alive at this time, and thinking about people in my family and when they were alive kind of really makes the time frame real to me. To think that there was a time when my parents were alive that Indigenous people weren't allowed to vote, that makes it seem like it wasn't so long ago. And I think it's important to really think about time and history in that way, so that you have an appreciation for how things have changed. Now, I guess the last thing I want to say before this lesson is over, you might be looking at these three ladies here and thinking they are amazing ladies because of all the work that they did. And any female in the class, yeah, I mean, you can really thank them for the rights that you have now as a woman in this country, because they started the process and got really a lot of the most important things accomplished. But at the same time, they have a dark they also have a dark past, or they did some things that are really very terrible as well. And I have to explain that at the time there was this idea of eugenics that was very popular around the world, and made, most notably made very popular by a guy named Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazis in Germany during World War II. Eugenics was the idea that we could build a greater human race by doing two things: encouraging the fittest of society to have babies together so that they would make stronger, smarter baby people, and at the same time stopping what they considered the worst part of society from breeding. I'm going to read the terminology here. Where do we have it? So, negative eugenics was the discouraging procreation by those considered unfit. Eugenicists argued that mental deficiencies and the feeble-minded were prone to alcoholism, promiscuity, mental illness, delinquency, and criminal behavior, and thus threatened the moral fabric of the community. These concerns led to increasing support for eugenic legislation, including the sterilization of defectives, meaning that they would do a medical procedure that would make it impossible for the people that they determined were defective from having babies in the future. Now, Nellie McClung and some of the other ladies in the famous five that you see there, Emily Murphy being one of them, that's her right here. They were regarded as two of the most prominent and influential supporters of Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act, which organized the involuntarily sterilization of people considered mentally deficient. The law was enacted in 1928 and repealed in 1927. During that time, thousands of people who were considered psychotic or mentally defective underwent eugenic sterilization. So really terrible stuff. And another maybe intended or unintended side effect of this law is it was used on occasion in Alberta. I'm not sure the frequency, as an excuse to sterilize Indigenous women so that Indigenous women wouldn't be able to have babies. So really, really terrible part of our history. And this is all information I got from the Canadian Encyclopedia. So it brings into question a lot of things about history, and namely, can you celebrate somebody from like a historical perspective? Can you celebrate the great things they did for society when they've also done such terrible things for society as well? And the assignment today is going to be, what do you think about that? Can you celebrate them and also learn and talk about the terrible things that they did as well? So it's going to be up to you to tell me what you think about that. All right. Take care, everybody.